Hello, and welcome to Spain Writes America Reads, this series of virtual conversations that we organized to introduce recently translated books from Spain into the US. Today, we have the pleasure of having with us Andrés Barba and Lisa Dillman. Andrés is a very well-known author in Spain, and we're introducing his new book in English, which is A Luminous Republic, which was awarded in Spain. And we have the idea of obviously bringing him here again, but to do in-person presentation of his last book, which also deals with America. It's not translated yet. It's been published in Spain, Guastavino and Guastavino, which I highly advise you to read. To talk with him, we have his translator. We've been talking before that they know each other from 10 years now, and Lisa Dillman. Lisa has translated over 30 novels and teaches at Emory University. And his last, some of his last translations are The Beach by Pilar Quintana, on Silent Fury by Yuri Guerrera, and A Luminous Republic of Andrés Barba. He also translated Such Small Hands of Andrés too. We're going to start with a conversation. As always, we're going to read some part of the book. So I will ask Andrés to do like the king said in Alice in Wonderland. Start from the beginning, not go until the end and then stop, but read the first paragraph of the book, and then we'll listen to the first paragraph of the book translated by Lisa. Andrés, you have the floor when you can.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you very much, Lisa, for joining us here and to this chance of talking to her. We've been without talking to each other for almost 2 years now, and in the last month, we've been talking like two times at least for the moment. So I'm going to start reading the first paragraph of the first page of the book in Spanish, and then Lisa will read it in English. It says like, cuando me preguntan por los 32 niños que perdieron la vida en San Cristóbal, mi respuesta varía según la edad de mi interlocutor. Si tiene la mía, respondo que comprender no es más que recomponer lo que solo hemos visto fragmentariamente. Si es más joven, le pregunto si cree o no en los malos presagios. Casi siempre me contestan que no, como si creer en ellos supusiera tenerle poco aprecio a la libertad. Yo no hago más preguntas y les cuento entonces mi versión de los hechos, porque es lo único que tengo y porque sería inútil convencerlos de que no se trata tanto de que aprecien la libertad como de que no crean tan ingenuamente en la justicia. Si yo fuese un poco más enérgico o un poco menos cobarde, comenzaría mi historia siempre con la misma frase. Casi todo el mundo tiene lo que se merece y los malos presagios existen. Vaya que sí existen.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. I'll just echo Andrés's thanks very much to the Embajada Española, the Spain Arts and Culture for inviting us. This is just really a lovely series. I looked at the page of who's done these talks already before and was really impressed with the list of authors and happy to see that I knew most of the translators. So I'm happy and honored to be added to that list. And now I will read the same paragraph in English that Andrés has just read in Spanish. When I'm asked about the 32 children who lost their lives in San Cristóbal, my response varies depending on the age of my interlocutor. If we're the same age, I say that understanding is simply a matter of piecing together that which was previously seen as disjointed. If they're younger, I ask if they believe in bad omens. Almost always they'll say no, as if doing so would mean they had little regard for freedom. I ask no more questions and then tell them my version of events, because this is all that I have, and because it would be pointless to try to convince them that believing, or not, is less about their regard for freedom than their naive faith in justice. If I were a little more forthright, or a little less of a coward, I'd always begin my story the same way. Almost everyone gets what they deserve, and bad omens do exist. Oh, they most certainly do.
It sounds good to me in English now.
Great, what I like to hear. So Andres, this is really interesting to me, and I was wondering if you could, you start off immediately, obviously, speaking about the 32 children in retrospect. So from the first line of the book, we know that there are 32 children who will die in the course of this book. And yet the sense of mystery, the sense of suspense is somehow maintained throughout, despite the end result being a foregone conclusion. Was that a plan from the beginning, and were there concrete kind of novelistic moves that you had to make in order to be able to attain that?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, that was not obviously the first line that I wrote when I started writing this novel. There were like 2 months ago, I was reading an article Nabokov wrote on Lolita, and he said that he tried twice to write the book before Lolita, and without those failures, Lolita wouldn't have been possible ever. And it happened the same to me. I tried not twice but 3 times to write this book before, and maybe I wasn't getting the tone of the book. Maybe I wasn't just the plot. I had a problem with the plot. It was not working for some reason, and that was like the 4th time that I was trying to write the book, and I get a grant to go to London just to begin the novel. And that time, I remember myself in London, I think it was St. Mary something. I don't even remember the name of the university I was in. And I wrote the first line, well, the kids are already dead. And I remember thinking to myself, what I've done, what I'm going to do now. So this sense of mystery, it was a sense of mystery even for me. I was the other day also reading a lecture that Flannery O'Connor gave on a short story she wrote called The Good Country People. I think it's a very well-known short story about about a girl very like herself, like Flannery O'Connor, who is in the countryside, and there's arrived this Bible seller, and they have kind of a so weird affair in the woods, and the girl had like a wooden leg, and at the very end of the story, this guy stole the leg of the girl. It is such a weird and cruel and amazing and realistic, and you never expect that. At the same time, is the only thing that could happen, and all these feelings are mixed. And Flannery O'Connor, talking about these situations, she says, well, it was a shock for the character because it was a shock for me as a writer when I wrote it. And I think this is the case with Luminous Republic. It was a shock for me to write this first line when I wrote it. And I say to myself, well, I have to solve this problem now. So this is not going to be the mystery anymore. But the thing is, how can a whole town arrive to this point? This is going to be the plot. So, and I remember myself at that time, I went to the movies with my girlfriend, now my wife. I remember that because we married like not long later. We went to see this Haneke movie. It was called La Cinta Blanca. I don't know the title in English. Should be like, it is a movie on the pre-Nazi Germany. And it's a movie on how a bunch of kids is cruel with another kid.
Oh.
Nothing to do with the Nazis, but the plot of the movie is to explain how a country could be charged with violence before a violent event happened. Like what happened to Germany, what happened in the pre-Nazi Germany to make these people able to do the things they did afterwards. what happened there? What was in the air? What were their feelings and what was happening there? So that, I think that is more in the spirit of this novel. It's not about who's going to be the killer. It's not about who is what happened next, but how are we able to do the things we're able to do? I mean, how do we fool ourselves as a society to do the things that we want to do, but we would never forgive us to do if we will say them plainly to ourselves. So it's about, yeah, please.
So can I ask a quick follow-up question based on that?
Sure.
So I remember, I don't know, probably 5 years ago or so, you gave a guest appearance in one of my fiction classes at Emory about Las Manos Pequeñas. And I remember you talking about Hannah Arendt and about the concept of cruelty and looking inward and who's capable of doing what and not otherizing and you know, saying these people are monsters, we could never do this and that sort of thing. No. And I hadn't concretely thought of it in those terms until what you just said right now. But I'm wondering now, is this an emotion or something that you play with and explore a lot in many of your works?
Well, it is really to the point that you quote this Hannah Arendt book, because the book actually was an essay of Eichmann in Jerusalem, an essay on the banality of evil. And it is one of the best, I think it's one of the best essays of the 20th century. She explores the notion of evil on the person of Adolf Eichmann, who was the responsible of one of the biggest killings in the 20th century, the Holocaust, in the Nazi period in Germany. And she goes to the trial in Jerusalem, was a ceremonial trial, an international trial to this person. He was not in Germany, but in Jerusalem for symbolic reasons, obviously. And she goes there expecting to watch the perfect devil, the perfect evil of the 20th century. And what she finds is a civil servant. And that is the most amazing thing is she said, we need to reconsider our notion of what evil is in front of the fact that the person who is responsible of the worst killing in the century is not a bad person, but a civil servant who is obeying the law. And that is what changes everything. That is in the center of any of my books. There is always a question about something like that. In this particular book, there is a question on childhood, that in general terms about what childhood is and why we have made it along the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, this fiction out of childhood that we need to believe desperately. This fiction on purity, this fiction of innocence, this fiction of sanctity, this fiction of paradise. What is all these characteristics attached to childhood? And that is quite recent in our cultural history, in a way. Why that this happened to us, and why trying to protect ourselves doing this with childhood, you know? And that is in the very core of the book from the very beginning. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I have questions about translation for you.
Okay.
I don't know, because we both are translators, you from Spanish, me from English. With the books we translate from English into Spanish, we have always an issue on what should be the Spanish version we translate the English version to. especially when the publishing houses are based in Latin America and selling the books in Spain? And how do we translate the local versions of Spanish, the Argentinian version, the Mexican version, etc., when we're translating classical books? And how that affects in political terms to our perspective of our own language in a way. Considering, for instance, that for a very long time, Latin American readers have been reading Spanish peninsular versions of their classical American or British authors. And for instance, during the dictatorship in Spain, the Spanish readers were forced to read Argentinian and Mexican versions of the Italian authors they couldn't read in Spain, etc. But now it's more like a political issue from my point of view. So the question would be like the other way around. Do you feel there's a parallel theme of that in the English translation world, or with British and American English?
I think it's a really, really fascinating topic, and I do feel that, and I do think it exists. I think it exists to a lesser intensity in English. But for example, for many years, people talked about translating into what they called mid-Atlantic English, which was supposedly some sort of neutral hybrid between British and American that would not be off-putting to anyone, that would complacer, all parties, etc. And I personally, for example, have issues with that concept, because one of the things that I'm always very cognizant of is that although obviously any translation is based on an original text, it must also be an autonomous text. There's a theorist and professor of translation, David Bellos, who has a sentence or a saying that I love, which is, people always say that a translation is no substitute for the original, as in, you should always read the original, it's always going to be better. And he says, and of course, the great irony is that that's precisely what a translation is. It's the substitute for the original, right? And so the implication therein, which I heartily agree with, is that the translation must be its own autonomous text. It cannot only be read against the original. And my feeling is that if you attempt to go for some neutralized, whitewashed blanket language that's going to complacer everyone, it's going to ring a little bit hollow. There's going to be some authenticity of voice that's lost. It might be very minor, but it's going to exist. And so by the same token, there are US publishers, UK publishers, rights are sold in the Anglophone world that can be, the world rights can be sold, or Australia, New Zealand rights can be sold separately, or US, UK, sometimes there will be two publishers who are going together to publish a book, one in the US and one in the UK, and so on. And they may have, depending on the publishers, more stronger or more lenient views on the acceptability of certain usages. So there are certain things that I know, if there are certain publishers who I just kind of choose not to engage with, despite perhaps liking maybe books that they've bought the rights to, because I know that they just want British English. And because, I do have dual citizenship and I lived in the UK for a long time, I could sort of do it, but it wouldn't be really authentic. And yet there are always moments where you come across some lexical item, whether it be one of those things like, one of the great examples in Spanish for me is always something like, mochila or whatever. Like, how many words for mochila are there depending on where you are, right? Like, salve que, how many, and those sorts. So there's the reverse equivalent of that, right? So when you come to those words that are strikingly just either quite American or quite British, then what do you do? And I will admit that I do have, it's something that's present, right? It's something that's in my mind, but my practice tends to try to avoid any self-conscious mimicking of a particular English. And in general, that also means making something self-consciously American. Because as far as translation strategy goes, I always believe that one of the reasons we read foreign literature is because we want to learn things about other people in other places and how other people live and work and think and breathe and everything else. And so, if I make somebody with an Andalus accent, turn into somebody with a Southern American accent, that is, I feel, disingenuous, because readers then will assume, it's very hard to do really well, right? It easily comes off as hokey or not quite authentic. And B, it's just BS, frankly, right? I mean, you cannot say that some, Sevillano is the equivalent to Alabama, right? It's just not the case. And so I know the reverse has often been true, right? With representing African-American language in Spanish. I think that's also an issue of what Spanish is chosen, right? So all of this to say, yes, it is an issue in English, but it's certainly less of an issue than it is, I think, in Spanish, particularly with 20 countries. But I do know, another author who I translate, for example, even for him to have his original works published in Spain, he's Guatemalan, even having his original works published in Spain, Spanish publishers want him to change things and change syntax, change usages, which I just find really objectionable.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah. I was thinking, while you were talking about this, I was thinking how different are the cultures that have a good translation of the Bible from the culture that they haven't. And I have this issue when I was translating Melville's Moby Dick, because you guys have this King James translation of the Bible that is in the very center of your culture. I mean, you can imagine authors like Whitman, Faulkner, Melville, they're impossible without the King James translation of the Bible. We don't have, in Germany, for instance, they have the Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, which is one of the best, so it's the translation of the Bible. And when I was translating Moby Dick into Spanish, I thought, what would be the parallel?
The Reina Valera, no?
Well, there's Alfonso el Sabio version of the Bible, which is like very, like, would be like the most literary version of the Bible. But at the same time, with Melville, the language in the novel is supposed to be deliberately archaic. How do you do a translation from one language to another, trying to keep the sound of an archaic language into another? It's so crazy. There's no way to do that without creating a new book. Jorge Luis Borges used to say he liked it more the English version of Don Quixote than the Spanish version. So you never know. The thing is, you never know what the book is going to turn into when you translate it into another language. The implications of the very notions that create the book are different because they are all read from a different perspective. That happened with this, I think also with República Luminosa in a way. Because our terms of community and childhood and all these terms are different in a way.
Well, I think it's a good time if you want to read, to see if it sounds better, if the book sounds better in English than in Spanish. So Andrés, read another paragraph.
This is almost the beginning of the third chapter of the book, just one paragraph. En el ensayo sobre los altercados titulado La vigilancia y publicado en el primer aniversario de la muerte de los 32, la profesora García Ribelles dedica un largo capítulo al mito de la inocencia infantil. El mito de la inocencia infantil, dice, es una forma bastardeada, positiva y cómoda del mito del paraíso perdido. Santos, intercesores y vestales de esa religión de bolsillo, a los niños se les encarga que representen para los adultos el estado de gracia original. Pero aquellos niños que habían comenzado a tomar silenciosamente las calles se parecían muy poco a las dos versiones de esa gracia original que habíamos conocido hasta la fecha, nuestros propios hijos y los niños ñe. Es verdad que los niños ñe estaban sucios y sin escolarizar, es cierto que eran pobres y que la miopía de la sociedad de San Cristóbal daba por descontado que eran irrescatables, pero su condición de indígenas no solo suavizaba ese estado, sino que en cierto modo lo hacía invisible. Por muy lastimosos, sucios y a menudo afectados por enfermedades víricas que los viéramos, ya nos habíamos inmunizado contra su situación. Podíamos comprarle alguna orquídea o bolsita de limones sin alterarnos. Aquellos niños eran pobres e iletrados, como la selva era verde, la tierra roja y el río Eré cargaba toneladas de fango. We can hear you, Lisa. We can hear you.
Thank you. I just said I love that paragraph. Okay, so in English, in an essay about the altercations titled Vigilance, published on the first anniversary of the deaths of the 32, Professor Garcia Ribelles dedicates one long section to the myth of childhood innocence. The myth of childhood innocence, she writes, is a bastardized, facile, hopeful take on the myth of paradise lost. Saints, intercessors, and vestals of an ersatz religion, children are charged with representing the state of original grace for adults. But these children, the ones who had silently begun overtaking the streets, bore little resemblance to the two versions of the state of original grace we'd known previously, our own children and the Nye children. It's true that the Nye were dirty and unschooled. Yes, they were poor, and San Cristobalites, in their short-sightedness, assumed that they were a lost cause. But the fact that they were indigenous not only took the edge off this state, in a way, it also rendered it invisible. Regardless of how pitiful, filthy, and often virus-ridden they looked, we'd become immune to their situation. We could buy an orchid or a small bag of limes from them without becoming distressed. The Nye were poor and illiterate in the same way the jungle was green, the earth red, and the river Ere heaved with mud. Okay. Coming off of that, one of the things that really fascinates me about this novel that I love, and if I'm not mistaken, I don't recall you doing it in other previous novels, is this sort of oh my gosh, I forget the word in English. It's oh, I learned it recently too, but it's so much more common in Spanish, intercalar. You know, the way do we say intercalated? No, there's a word that's used expressly. Anyway, I'll fudge it. The way you work through the text, a number of sociologists, linguists, political theorists, right? These brief excerpts are sort of, I'm going to go for it and say intercalated throughout the. Miguel, did you find the word?
Maybe insert.
Yeah, but I'll come up with that at the end and I'll let people know.
I'm looking at it in the dictionary and there's one that I like, it says sandwich.
A sandwich definitely works, it's just a lower register, but yes, absolutely. So these other texts are woven in, shall we say. And it also introduces Say again?
Interpolate.
We could say interpolate, we could say that. So these texts are woven throughout, and they introduce a number of different perspectives and also different registers, different voices. They also sort of perhaps introduce, and this is, you know, a maybe, but they sort of perhaps introduce the concept of the narrator's potential unreliability, right? Because we have competing narratives for what happened, and we have the narrator's take on what happened. And based on the events that we see in a lot of these secondary sources that he quite often sort of scoffs at or eviscerates or has issues with, and I find often a lot of humor in his tear down of these people. There's a part where he talks about the tortuous populist syntax of one of the writers, which is just something I love. But it's really interesting to me, this concept of introducing other people's ideas in different registers that simultaneously introduces a potential unreliability there. And I was just wondering if you kind of had any general comments on that.
Yeah, sure. And you're right. This is a very peculiar novel in the type of novel I've been doing for my entire life, as you know. This is a very particular one, because in this one, I tried to use a collective character, and I was more interested in doing a political fiction than a psychological fiction, as I used to do before, much more of the time. So in this case, I was in my philosophic background. There's a very important book by Junger Habermas on this subject that is called, it's a theory on truth as a consensus, as an agreement. And this wonderful German philosopher has this theory of truth is not an event, but an agreement. It's something that we agree. And that is like an anti-Aristotelical theory of truth is very appealing to me, especially in the light of the Spanish Civil War and how we've been dealing with our recent past in Spain, and how we need to agree what happened. And it was very appealing to me to write a political fiction around on the idea of a small society that goes through a traumatic event, and now they have to decide what actually happened to them. And they don't actually know really what happened to them. How they were possible, how were they able to do the things they did, and what actually happened at that moment. And in order to do that, we are in a way a mystery to ourselves, not only in individual terms, in personal terms, but as a society, we are a mystery to ourselves. So there's something we have to decipher, what we've done, what we are. Not only we have to decipher and discover what we did or who we are, but we have to agree among us who we are and what we've done here. And that is the most appealing thing to do. I mean, that is why I used the format of a chronicle for this book. At the same time, I was translating Joseph Conrad's short stories for a Mexican publishing house, Sexto Piso. And it's very interesting how Joseph Conrad always used the same chronicle format for this type of fiction. The fiction in which he wants to confront two different versions of what a civilization is supposed to be. Who is the one who represents the reason, the logical thinking, the philosophy, the good manners, the civilization? Who is the one who represents that? And the answer is not only clear, it's impossible to do. It's never clear, and it's impossible to say who is the one who is in the side of logical reason. Here, I wanted to do that because in the very beginning of the book, I think we talk about this, but in the very beginning of this book, there is a documentary film called The Children of Lenin Trotsky, made by Andrei Zelinsky. I have to write that because I never remember. Andrei Zelinsky and Hanna Polak, two Polish filmmakers who made this movie, non-fiction movies, a documentary film on a child community that lived in the subway in the city of Leningradsky in the end of the 80s. And it was amazing how they did that in terms of the perspective they chose at that time to make the movie. They decided to take off the screen all the adults involved in a way, because they were screening the kids at the same level of the heads of the kids. So just only with that, you have an absolutely different perspective. It's like Tom and Jerry. You remember the Tom and Jerry things that you only see the legs of the people, and you can see Tom and Jerry running and chasing each other, but the human beings were out of the screen completely. You remember? So that was the same thing. I was more interested on how a truth is made. That was my main purpose. How a truth is made, how we related, how we agree what truth was, what was the truth. How do we recover ourselves of a traumatic event as a society, trying to agree what happened? And that goes through making audible all the voices that were not heard at that time, all the minority voices. I mean, feminism is doing this now in historical terms, is doing the same thing. In order to get a huge agreement about truth or about what we want to do as a society, we need to hear everybody. And that is something that in chronicle terms, you can do only what 20 years have gone from the traumatic events. Now you're in a position that you can tell from a neutral way what could be a truth, what could be a truth that we could agree to, you know. So that was the main core of the book, the political fiction.
That's really fascinating. It makes me think a lot of Mona Baker, who's a translation practitioner and theorist who I love a lot, but she writes about the relationship between socio-narrative theory and translation. And socio-narrative theory, the way we create narratives, right? And the reigning narratives which are brought forth that get to tell the stories of what happened, and how this is done through narrative accrual, i.e. repeating the same idea so that it gets into your head, but also, she takes Paul Ricoeur's idea of, I said that name wrong, but Ricoeur's idea of causal emplotment, right? And how, so you therefore take a single episode and force it into be part of the plot. So you actively make sense of something that happened. And when something else comes along that perhaps contradicts that narrative, you force it in another direction, through use of selective appropriation and these sorts of things. So that's really fascinating.
There's an amazing, maybe you know her, Hannah Gadsby, Australian comedian, who she has a stand-up on that, about the limits of laughter and all that, and she repeats like a mantra all the time for an hour: I need to tell my story properly. And I think it's a very good motto. I think we need to tell our story properly, and this is something that we can only get doing this again and again and again. We need to tell our story properly, implies to tell it again and again, and make it the more people possible tell the same story again. That is the only way for us to get the most range of perspectives about reality that we can get.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I remember 3 years ago, I translated a fascinating book by Henry James called New York. It was a book, it was an anthology of all the short stories written by Henry James in the city of New York. I mean, with the city of New York as a scenario for the story. And it's very interesting because he's been writing stories about New York his entire life. His first short story was a story on New York, and his last short story was always also plot in New York. And it was so interesting translating this book because you could follow the transition of Henry James' style throughout his life. From the very beginning, how his sentences at the very beginning were short, and they started to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. At the very end of his career, he was writing like 3 pages long sentences, you know? And it's so interesting also when he decided to dictate with the transition of his writing, when he was handwriting, to the dictate his own stories to another person, a secretary who was typing the book. And it was very interesting because you could follow the development of his style. I think that you are a witness of that with me because you've been translating my books for a very, very long time. Maybe it sounds a bit narcissistic question, but I would love to know if you have noticed that these things has been changing throughout these 10 years that you've been translating me, or because I have the feeling that I've been changing a lot, but sometimes one have the feeling that he's changing a lot and it's the same person all the time. So my feeling is, do you think the style is been changing from like books like Katia's Sister or La Hermana de Katia or Las Manos Pequeñas to this one, or do you think it's the same, pretty much the same thing?
No, I definitely think that there has been an evolution in style, in content, maybe not in syntax, but for sure in style and content. And I feel I suppose it would be perhaps obvious and cliche to say, you know, a maturation, right? A coming into your own. But I do think that there is an element of that. I mean, I have, as you know, from day one, I've loved everything you wrote. I think it occurred to me afterwards, but what we were talking about just before this began is that when I translated that fragment of Hermana de Katia, that was 2003. So that was 18 years ago.
Don't say that.
And yeah, sorry to say. And you know, there are certain commonalities, definitely. There are certainly commonalities in the interiorness, if I can say that, of the books, in the sense that I've always felt that even though every book has a you could simply relate the plot, right? You could say what happens and get a sense of, you know, you could summarize probably most of your books in a paragraph and say this is what happens, and absolutely have no sense of the book, because you are one of these writers who I absolutely feel that although it has not always been the same style, and although there is clearly an evolution, that form and content are absolutely married, in the sense that without the rhythm and the flow and the cadence of your prose, and without the really evocative but strikingly unusual sometimes descriptions of interior states of mind. And those things are not part of the action, right? Those things are descriptions, literal descriptions of what someone was feeling. And I used to often feel that they revolved around obsession, different forms of obsession. And I think I probably feel that there's, you know, maybe that when I say, you know, a certain maturity to your more recent books, there is a more calmly reflective and self-reflective manner about them, I think, which translates into an element of perhaps self-awareness that I feel was not present, not present to the same degree earlier on. It's also perhaps difficult for me because, in a sense, I think I have also changed over the course of those 17 years, and so perhaps part of me feels a little bit difficult to, you know, it's like if you don't see somebody for 2 years, you go, oh my gosh, you look totally different. But if you see them every month, to you, they look the same, right? So there's a little bit of an element of that because I read everything you write the moment it comes out, right? But the thing that I feel has not changed, which to my mind is one of the things that makes your writing so unique in the contemporary landscape, is your syntax. It's just really, really, I never know how to pronounce this in English, but sui generis, you know, it's sui generis, I think we say in English. It really defines, it's the sort of thing that you read in Spanish and it flows completely naturally and you go bum, 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 and you start translating it and think, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, how on earth does this work in English, you know? Sometimes with, you know, sentences that are a page long, but that's sort of, I mean, you know, Spanish is in general known for longer sentences vis-a-vis English, right? But I'm not just talking about these standard ways in which Romance language writing can easily tack on multiple dependent clauses. I'm talking about unique inversions, unique punctuation that in my mind really, really gives your writing a gravitas to the feel that it's got, that makes, and that to me has always been there.
Wow, that's very interesting. You know, I mean, it may sound that I was fishing for compliments, but the thing is, I really wanted to know, because what happened to me, and maybe you feel yourself the same as a translator, is I remember better the things that I've translated that the books I've written for some reason. And you probably know better the books that I've written than myself. That is so strange. People don't believe that, but it is really true. I remember better the books that I've translated because they're like fixed images of them in my mind. I've been dealing with those sentences with in a very intense way, in a very accurate way. Meanwhile, writing a book is a very chaotic thing to do. You never know at the very end of the book which version it is at the very end. That's why when people is talking to you about the book, sometimes you don't know what they're talking about. You know, it happened to me once. I think it was with I don't remember what book was, that I changed one of the name of the characters at the very end of the book with the computer. I mean, I didn't even, it was the computer, the character was called Teresa and I put Marina, I don't remember. People were asking me about Marina, and I was saying to myself, who is Marina? You know, I don't even remember a character named Marina for me. So the thing, and it was nice. A couple of months I read in a Jean-Paul Sartre essay that we writers are the only persons not allowed to read our own books. We never could have a neutral perception of our own books, and that makes sense to me a lot. That was why I was asking you that question, because you probably know better about my style than myself. And this is
One time hearing you I remember one time hearing you make a statement about Las Manos Pequeñas that I knew was wrong. And I don't remember what it was, but
It's so fun.
Maybe we get there's two questions in the audience. The first one, which was done at the beginning, deals with something that you've talked about, which is your style. It's Lisa Manson that says, how do you find the tone of each book? You have a recognizable style, but it changes according to each book. Thanks.
Lisa.
No, that's for you, Andrés.
Me? Well,
You said that you've evolved, your style has evolved, that you have the idea that it has evolved. What he's suggesting is more that it depends on the subject of the book, that you find a different tone, and that book makes its own style.
In the sense that what I think the worst thing that can happen to a writer is professionalize. I don't know if that's a word in English. Professionalize himself or herself, because that's the moment in which you're dead as a writer. That you write like a professional. That is something that happened a lot in America because the writers tend to write their books with their publishers seated in the other side of the table and thinking all the time in the market. So that happened more often in the American market. But anyway, I'll tell a story about this style thing. Is when I never, Lisa knows that, never write about my life. I mean, this is something I don't write about my life. But when my dad died 5 years ago, I decided to write poems about the life of my dad just for myself, but from the very beginning, I knew that there was something in me that knew I wanted to write about my dad. I wanted to write about him. At that time in Spain, there were a lot of writers writing on their father's death.
Marcos started it, and
For instance, and now, well, there's like a lot of Martín Menéndez Salmón, Vilas. There's a lot, thousands of them. I think this is impossible to avoid. As a writer, to write about your dad, if your dad has been the most important person in your life. But the thing was, I didn't want to write as a professional writer for about a subject like that. So I decided to make the book the less selling possible thing. Like I'm going to write a book of poems, not only because it was impossible to take profit out of that book, because nobody was going to buy a book of poems, but because that things for me to learn again to write in a new language that it was unknown for me, that was the language of poetry. I think you have to put yourself, in order to avoid the temptation of become a professional writer, which is to become a zombie, for me, from my perspective, is to put yourself in a position that you need to learn again and again how to write. That happened again this time with this Guastavino book you talked at the beginning of this lecture. Was the first time I wrote a biography. And it's also a book about how to write a biography. It's a book that reflects a lot about how impossible it is for a writer to tell the truth about the life of anyone, you know? So I think it's also a cliche, I know, like you have to find a way to write every book, but it's the truth, it's the naked truth. You need to learn again from the very beginning to write every book you write. If you're not doing this, you're becoming a professional writer. That is to say, you're dead. Yeah.
There's another question from Richard Olsen. It says, thank you for such an interesting discussion, Andrés. Many of your books have been translated and published in the US. From your experience, how difficult is it for a foreign author to be known in the US?
Well, that's something we've been talking with Lisa a lot about this. That is something that have changed a lot in the last 10 years, let's say. 10 years ago, I think it was the Granta list that it was the first Spanish authors grant list. It was 2001, Lisa, you remember? 2008, 9?
I think it was, yeah, 10 years ago, exactly. Oh, like 2010.
At that time, it was almost impossible for a literary writer in Spain to be translated in the US. Almost impossible is like you had to be really very, very lucky. You were a bestseller, it was easier, but if you were like a literary writer, it was almost impossible. That at that moment, the percent is still very low, but the percent, it was incredibly low at that time from the literature in translation in the US. From the moment that you are translated only, let's say, 2 or 3 Spanish authors, you need to be Spanish enough to be translated into English. That is something that is terrible and cruel, but happened in the cultural context that they're not translating too much fiction. You need to confirm the prejudice that culture have on your culture. That says that if that culture thinks, for instance, this is just an example, that the epitome of Spanish culture is Pedro Almodóvar, you have to be Almodóvarian to be translated into that culture. That has changed a lot thanks to the emerging of a lot of small publishing houses in the US and UK. That changed the landscape a lot because 10 years ago, it was mostly, maybe Lisa can, I mean, if I'm saying something that is not true, please, Lisa, but at that moment, it was mostly university presses which are like doing this type of thing.
I would say university presses or very commercial historical fiction.
Yeah. That's why now the key element that has changed the landscape is all these small publishing houses that willing to publish literature in translation in the US. I think that's been the key element.
Maybe we have a last question. For Lisa. It's a question. Radica that first said that made a comment saying that saludos desde Canadá. Well, and he's asking, I have a question about the use of the word jungle in the paragraph translated and read. For me, it was full of foreboding and foreshadowing. What's the original bosque? I do not know, of course, whether that paragraph falls in the middle of or the beginning of the novel. My question is whether this is inadvertent foreshadowing because of translation. A happy accident, of course.
Yeah, I put a quick response in the chat, but first, hello Radhika, and thank you for the question. And I am unable to claim that as a translatorial strategy, I'm afraid to say, because it's the first paragraph in the novel, and the original was selva, so it's just a literal translation of selva to jungle. Okay,
I think we've reached our. I mean, I would be speaking with you for hours because I think it's been very, very interesting. I hope, as you know, what we do with these chats, that afterwards we edited them and that we put them in our web, so people that have not been able to watch them today, they can watch it afterwards. I want to thank you both, Andrés and Lisa. It was really fascinating to hear you both, and invite our audience to watch our next Spain Writes America Reads, and to thank Ander, of course, and also Politics and Prose, who are collaborating with us in this project. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.